If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like, and share. We are reading The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, Part 5, Parts to Recovery, Chapter 13, Healing from Trauma, Owning Yourself. I don't go to therapy to find out if I'm a freak. I go and I find the one and only answer every week. And when I talk about therapy, I know what people think, that it only makes you selfish and in love with your shrink. But oh, how I loved everybody else when I finally got to talk so much about myself. Dar Williams, what do you hear in these sounds? Nobody can treat a war or abuse, rape, molestation, or any other horrendous event for that matter. What has happened cannot be undone. But what can be dealt with are the imprints of the trauma on body, mind, and soul. The crushing sensation in your chest that you may label as anxiety or depression, the fear of losing control, always being on alert for danger or rejection, the self loathing, the nightmares and flashbacks, the fog that keeps you from staying on task and from engaging fully in what you are doing, being unable to fully open your heart to another human being. Trauma robs you of the feeling that you are in charge of yourself, of what I will call self leadership in the chapters to come. The challenge of recovery is to re establish ownership of your body and your mind, of yourself. This means feeling free to know what you know and to feel what you feel without becoming overwhelmed, enraged, ashamed, or collapsed. For most people, this involves one, finding a way to become calm and focused, two, learning to maintain that calm in response to images, thoughts, sounds, or physical sensations that remind you of the past. Three, finding a way to be fully alive in the present and engage with the people around you. Four, not having to keep secrets from yourself, including secrets about the ways that you have managed to survive. These goals are not steps to be achieved, one by one in some fixed sequence. They overlap, and some may be more difficult than others, depending on individual circumstances. In each of the chapters that follow, I will talk about specific methods or approaches to accomplish them. I have tried to make these chapters useful both to trauma survivors and to the therapists who are treating them. People under temporary stress may also find them useful. I have used every one of these methods extensively to treat my patients, and I have also experienced them myself. Some people get better using just one of these methods, but most are helped by different approaches at different stages of their recovery. I have done scientific studies of many of the treatments I describe here, and have published the research findings in peer reviewed scientific journals. My aim in this chapter is to provide an overview of underlying principles, a preview of what is to come, and some brief comments on methods I don't cover in depth later on. A new focus for recovery. When we talk about trauma, we often start with a story or a question. What happened during the war? Were you ever molested? Let me tell you about that accident or that rape. Or was anybody in your family a problem drinker? However, trauma is much more than a story about something that happened long ago. The emotions and physical sensations that were imprinted during the trauma are experienced not as memories but as disruptive physical reactions in the present. In order to regain control over yourself, you need to revisit the trauma. Sooner or later, you need to confront what has happened to you, but only after you feel safe and will not be re traumatized by it. The first order of business is to find ways to cope with feeling overwhelmed by the sensations and emotions associated with the past. As the previous parts of this book have shown, the engines of post traumatic reactions are located in the emotional brain. In contrast with the rational brain, which expresses itself in thoughts, the emotional brain manifests itself in physical reactions, gut wrenching sensations, heart pounding, breathing becoming fast and shallow, feelings of heartbreak, speaking with an upright and reedy voice, and the characteristic body movements that signify collapse, rigidity, rage, or defensiveness. Why can't we just be reasonable? And can understanding help? The rational executive brain is good at helping us understand where feelings come from, as in I get scared when I get close to a guy because my father molested me, or I have trouble expressing my love towards my son because I feel guilty about having killed a child in Iraq. However, the rational brain cannot abolish emotions, sensations, or thoughts, such as living with a low level sense of threat or feeling that you are fundamentally a terrible person, even though you rationally know that you are not to blame for having been raped. Understanding why you feel a certain way does not change how you feel, but it can keep you from surrendering to intense reactions. For example, assaulting a boss who reminds you of a perpetrator, breaking up with a lover at your first disagreement, or jumping into the arms of a stranger. However, the more frazzled we are, the more our rational brains take a backseat to our emotions. Limbic system therapy. The fundamental issue in resolving traumatic stress is to restore the proper balance between the rational and emotional brain so that you can feel in charge of how you respond and how you conduct your life. When we are triggered into states of hyper or hypoarousal, we are pushed outside our window of tolerance, the range of optimal functioning. We become reactive and disorganized. Our filters stop working. Sounds and lights bother us. Unwanted images from the past intrude on our mind, and we panic or fly into rages. If we are shut down, we feel numb in body and mind. Our thinking becomes sluggish, and we have trouble getting out of our chairs. As long as people are either hyper aroused or shut down, they cannot learn from experience, even if they manage to stay in control. They become so uptight, Alcoholics Anonymous calls this white knuckle sobriety, that they are inflexible, stubborn, and depressed. Recovery from trauma involves the restoration of executive functioning and with it, self confidence and the capacity for playfulness and creativity. If we want to change post traumatic reactions, we have to access the emotional brain and do limbic system therapy, repairing faulty alarm systems and restoring the emotional brain to its ordinary job of being a quiet background presence that takes care of the housekeeping of the body, ensuring that you eat, sleep, connect with intimate partners, protect your children, and defend against danger. This diagram is by Licia Sky, accessing the emotional brain. The rational analyzing part of the brain centered on the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex has no direct connections with the emotional brain, as we can see, where most imprints of trauma reside, but the medial prefrontal cortex, the center of self awareness, does. The neuroscientist Joseph Ledoux and his colleagues have shown that the only way we can consciously access the emotional brain is through self awareness. That is, by activating the medial prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that notices what is going on inside us and thus allow us to feel what we are feeling. The technical term for this is interoception, Latin for looking inside. Most of our conscious brain is dedicated to focusing on the outside world, getting along with others, and making plans for the future. However, that does not help us manage ourselves. Neuroscience research shows that the only way we can change the way we feel is by becoming aware of our inner experience and learning to befriend what is going inside ourselves. Befriending the emotional brain. 1. Dealing with hyperarousal. Over the past few decades, mainstream psychiatry has focused on using drugs to change the way we feel, and this has become the accepted way to deal with hyper or hypoarousal. I will discuss drugs later in this chapter, but first I need to stress the fact that we have a host of inbuilt skills to keep us on an even keel. In chapter 5, we saw how emotions are registered in the body. Some 80% of the fibers of the vagus nerves, which connect the brain with many internal organs, are afferent. That is, they run from the body into the brain. This means that we can directly train our arousal system by the way we breathe, chant, and move, a principle that has been utilized since time immemorial in places like China and India and in every religious practice that I know of, but that is suspiciously eyed as alternative in mainstream culture. In research supported by the National Institute of Health, my colleagues and I have shown that 10 weeks of yoga practice markedly reduced the PTSD symptoms of patients who had failed to respond to any medication or to any other treatment. I will discuss yoga in chapter 16. Neurofeedback, the topic of chapter 19, also can be particularly effective for children and adults who are so hyper aroused or shut down that they have trouble focusing and prioritizing. Learning how to breathe calmly and remaining in a state of relative physical relaxation, even while accessing painful and horrifying memories, is an essential tool for recovery. When you deliberately take a few slow, deep breaths, you will notice the effects of the parasympathetic brake on your arousal. As explained in Chapter 5, the more you stay focused on your breathing, the more you will benefit, particularly if you pay attention until the very end of the out breath and then wait a moment before you inhale again. As you continue to breathe and notice the air moving in and out of your lungs, you may think about the role that oxygen plays in nourishing your body and bathing your tissues with the energy you need to feel alive and engaged. Chapter 16 documents the full body effects of this simple practice. Since emotional regulation is the critical issue in managing the effects of trauma and neglect, it would make an enormous difference if teachers and army surgeons, foster parents, and mental health professionals were thoroughly schooled in emotional regulation techniques. Right now, this still is mainly the domain of preschool and kindergarten teachers who deal with immature brains and impulsive behavior on a daily basis and who are often very adept at managing them. Mainstream Western psychiatric and psychological healing traditions have paid scant attention to self management, in contrast to the Western reliance on drugs and verbal therapies. Other traditions from around the world rely on mindfulness, movement, rhythms, and action. Yoga in India, Tai Chi and Qigong in China, and rhythmical drumming throughout Africa are just a few examples. The cultures of Japan and the Korea Peninsula have spawned martial arts which focus on the cultivation of purposeful movements and being centered in the present, abilities that are damaged in traumatized individuals. Aikido, Judo, Taekwondo, Kendo, and Jiu-Jitsu, as well as Capoeira from Brazil, are examples. These techniques all involve physical movement, breathing, and meditation. Aside from yoga, few of these popular known Western healing traditions have been systematically studied for the treatment of PTSD. Second, no mind without mindfulness. At the core of recovery is self awareness. The most important phrases in trauma therapy are notice that and what happens next. Traumatized people live with seemingly unbearable sensations. They feel heartbroken and suffer from intolerable sensations in the pit of their stomach or tightness in their chest, yet avoiding feeling these sensations in our bodies increases our vulnerability to being overwhelmed by them. Body awareness puts us in touch with our inner world, the landscape of our organism. Simply noticing our annoyance, nervousness, or anxiety immediately helps us shift our perspective and opens up new options other than our automatic habitual reactions. Mindfulness puts us in touch with the transitory nature of our feelings and perceptions. When we pay focused attention to our bodily sensation, we can recognize the ebb and flow of our emotions and with that increase our control over them. Traumatized people are often afraid of feeling. It is not so much the perpetrators, who hopefully are no longer around to hurt them, but their own physical sensations that are now the enemy. Apprehension about being hijacked by uncomfortable sensation keeps the body frozen and the mind shut. Even though the trauma is a thing of the past, the emotional brain keeps generating sensations that makes the sufferer feel scared and helpless. It's not surprising that so many trauma survivors are compulsive eaters and drinkers, fears making love and avoid many social activities. Their sensory world is largely off limit. In order to change, you need to open yourself to your inner experiences. The first step is to allow your mind to focus on your sensation and notice how, in contrast to the timeless, ever present experience of trauma, physical sensations are transient and respond to slight shifts in body positions, changes in breathing, and shifts in thinking. Once you pay attention to your physical sensation, the next step is to label them, as in when I feel anxious, I feel a crushing sensation in my chest. I may then say to a patient, focus on that sensation and see how it changes when you take a deep breath out and when you tap your chest just below your collarbone or when you allow yourself to cry. Practicing mindfulness calms down the sympathetic nervous system so that you are less likely to be thrown into fight or flight. Learning to observe and tolerate your physical reactions is a prerequisite for safely revisiting the past. If you cannot tolerate what you are feeling right now, opening up the past will only compound the misery and re traumatize you further. We can tolerate a great deal discomfort as long as we stay conscious of the fact that the body's commotions constantly shift. One moment your chest tightens, but after you take a deep breath and exhale, that feeling softens and you may observe something else. Perhaps a tension in your shoulder. Now you can start exploring what happens when you take a deeper breath and notice how your rib cage expands. Once you feel calmer and more curious, you can go back to the sensation in your shoulder. You should not be surprised if a memory spontaneously arises in which that shoulder was somehow involved. A further step is to observe the interplay between your thoughts and your physical sensations. How are particular thoughts registered in your body? Do thoughts like, my father loves me or my girlfriend dumped me, produce different sensations? Becoming aware of how your body organizes particular emotions or memories opens up the possibility of releasing sensations and impulses you once blocked in order to survive. In chapter 20, on the benefits of theater, I'll describe in more detail how this works. John Kabat-Zinn, one of the pioneers in mind-body medicine, founded the mindfulness-based stress reduction MBSR program at the University of Massachusetts Medical Center in 1979, and his method has been thoroughly studied for more than 3 decades. As he describes mindfulness, one way to think of this process of transformation is to think of mindfulness as a lens, taking the scattered and reactive energies of your mind and focusing them into a coherent source of energy for living, for problem solving, for healing. Mindfulness has been shown to have a positive effect on numerous psychiatric, psychosomatic, and stress related symptoms, including depression and chronic pain. It has broad effects on physical health, including improvements in immune response, blood pressure, and cortisol levels. It has also been shown to activate the brain regions involved in emotional regulation and to lead changes in the regions related to body awareness and fear. Research by my Harvard colleague Britta Holzil and Sarah Lazar has shown that practicing mindfulness even decreases the activity of the brain smoke detector, the amygdala, and thus decreases reactivity to potential triggers. Third, relationships. Study after study shows that having a good support network constitutes the single most powerful protection against becoming traumatized. Safety and terror are incompatible. When we are terrified, nothing calms us down like the reassuring voice or the firm embrace of someone we trust. Frightened adults respond to the same comfort as terrified children. Gentle holding and rocking, and the assurance that somebody bigger and stronger is taking care of things so you can safely go to sleep. In order to recover, mind, body, and brain need to be convinced that it is safe to let go. That happens only when you feel safe at a visceral level and allow yourself to connect that sense of safety with memories of past helplessness. After an acute trauma, like an assault, accident, or natural disaster, survivors require the presence of familiar faces, people, and voices, physical contact, food, shelter, and a safe place, and time to sleep. It is critical to communicate with loved ones close and far and to reunite as soon as possible with family and friends in a place that feels safe. Our attachment bonds are our greatest protection against threat. For example, children who are separated from their parents after a traumatic event are likely to suffer serious negative long term effects. Studies conducted during World War II in England showed that children who lived in London during the Blitz and were sent away to the countryside for protection against German bombing raids fared much worse than children who remained with their parents and endured nights in bomb shelters and frightened images of destroyed buildings and dead people. Traumatized human beings recover in the context of relationships with families, loved ones, AA meetings, veterans organization, religious communities, or professional therapists. The role of those relationships is to provide physical and emotional safety, including safety from feeling ashamed, admonished, or judged, and to bolster the courage to tolerate, face, and process the reality of what has happened. As we have seen, much the wiring of our brain circuits is devoted to being in tune with others. Recovery from trauma involves reconnecting with our fellow human beings. This is why trauma that has occurred within relationships is generally more difficult to treat than trauma resulting from traffic accidents or natural disasters. In our society, the most common trauma in women and children occur at the hands of their parents or intimate partners. Child abuse, molestation, and domestic violence all are inflicted by people who are supposed to love you. That knocks out the most important protection against being traumatized, being sheltered by the people you love. If the people whom you naturally turn to for care and protection terrify or reject you, you learn to shut down and to ignore what you feel. As we saw in part 3, when your caregivers turn on you, you have to find alternative ways to deal with feeling scared, angry, or frustrated. Managing your terror all by yourself gives rise to another set of problems: dissociation, despair, addiction, a chronic sense of panic, and relationships that are marked by alienation, disconnection, and explosions. Patients with these histories rarely make the connection between what happened to them long ago and how they currently feel and behave. Everything just seems unmanageable. Relief does not come until they are able to acknowledge what has happened and recognize the invisible demons they are struggling with. Recall, for example, the men I described in chapter 11 who had been abused by pedophile priests. They visited the gym regularly, took anabolic steroids, and were strong as oxen. However, in our interviews, they often acted like scared children. That hurt boys deep inside still felt helpless. While human contact and attunement are the well springs of physiological self regulation, the promise of closeness often evokes fear of getting hurt, betrayed, and abandoned. Shame plays an important role in this. You will find out how rotten and disgusting I am and dump me as soon as you really get to know me. Unresolved trauma can take a terrible toll on relationships. If your heart is still broken because you were assaulted by someone you loved, you are likely to be preoccupied with not getting hurt again and fear opening up to someone new. In fact, you may unwittingly try to hurt them before they have a chance to hurt you. This poses a real challenge for recovery. Once you recognize that post traumatic reaction started off as efforts to save your life, you may gather the courage to face your inner music or cacophony, but you will need help to do so. You have to find someone you can trust enough to accompany you, someone who can safely hold your feelings and help you listen to the painful message from your emotional brain. You need a guide who is not afraid of your terror and who can contain your darkest rage, someone who can safeguard the wholeness of you while you explore the fragmented experiences that you had to keep secret from yourselves for so long. Most traumatized individuals need an anchor and a great deal of coaching to do this work. Choosing a professional therapist. The training of competent trauma therapist involves learning about the impact of trauma, abuse, and neglect, and mastering a variety of techniques that can help to one, stabilize and calm patients down, two, help to lay traumatic memories and reenactments to rest, and three, reconnect patients with their fellow men and women. Ideally, the therapist will also have been on the receiving end of whatever therapy he or she practices. While it's inappropriate and unethical for therapists to tell you the details of their personal struggles, it is perfectly reasonable to ask what particular forms of therapy they have been trained in, where they learned their skills, and whether they have personally benefited from the therapy they proposed for you. There is no one treatment of choice for trauma, and any therapist who believes that his or her particular method is the only answer to your problems is suspect of being an ideologue rather than somebody who is interested in making sure that you get well. No therapist can possibly be familiar with every effective treatment, and he or she must be open to your exploring options other than the ones he or she offers. He or she also must be open to learning from you. Gender, race, and personal background are relevant only if they interfere with helping the patient feel safe and understood. Do you feel basically comfortable with this therapist? Does he or she seem to feel comfortable in his or her own skin and with you as a fellow human being? Feeling safe is a necessary condition for you to confront your fears and anxiety. Someone who is stern, judgmental, agitated, or harsh is likely to leave you feeling scared, abandoned, and humiliated, and that won't help you resolve your traumatic stress. There may be times as old feelings from the past are stirred up when you become suspicious that the therapist resembles someone who once hurt or abused you. Hopefully, this is something you can work through together because, in my experience, patients get better only if they develop deep positive feelings for their therapists. I also don't think that you can grow and change unless you feel that you have some impact on the person who is treating you. The critical question is this: do you feel that your therapist is curious to find out who you are and what you, not some generic PTSD patient, need? Are you just a list of symptoms on some diagnostic questionnaire, or does your therapist take the time to find out why you do what you do and think what you think? Therapy is a collaborative process, a mutual exploration of yourself. Patients who have been brutalized by their caregivers as children often do not feel safe with anyone. I often ask my patients if they can think of any person they feel with safe with while they were growing up. Many of them hold tight to the memory of that one teacher, neighbor, shopkeeper, coach, or minister who showed that he or she cared, and that memory is often the seed of learning to re engage. We are a hopeful species. Working with trauma is as much about remembering how we survived as it is about what is broken. I also ask my patients to imagine what they were like as newborns, whether they were lovable and filled with spunk. All of them believe they were and have some image of what they must have been like before they were hurt. Some people don't remember anybody they felt safe with. For them, engaging with horse or dogs may be much safer than dealing with human beings. This principle is currently being applied in many therapeutic settings to great effect, including in jails, residential treatment programs, and veteran rehabilitation. Jennifer, a member of the first graduating class of the Van der Kolk Center, who had come to the program as an out of control mute 14-year-old, said during her graduation ceremony that having been entrusted with the responsibility of caring for a horse was the critical first step for her. Her growing bond with her horse helped her feel safe enough to begin to relate to the staff of the center and then to focus on her classes, take her SATs, and be accepted to college. Fourth, communal rhythms and synchrony. From the moment of our birth, our relationships are embodied in responsive faces, gestures, and touch. As we saw in chapter 7, these are the foundations of attachment. Trauma results in a breakdown of attuned physical synchrony when you enter the waiting room of a PTSD clinic. You can immediately tell the patients from the staff by their frozen faces and collapsed but simultaneously agitated bodies. Unfortunately, many therapists ignore those physical communications and focus only on the words with which their patients communicate. The healing power of community, as expressed in music and rhythm, was brought home for me in the spring of 1997 when I was following the work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. In some places we visited, terrible violence continued. One day I attended a group for rape survivors in the courtyard of a clinic in a township outside Johannesburg. We could hear the sound of bullets being fired at a distance while smoke billowed over the walls of the compound and the smell of tear gas hung in the air. Later, we heard that 40 people had been killed. Yet, while the surroundings were foreign and terrifying, I recognized this group all too well. The women sat slumped over, sad and frozen, like so many rape therapy groups I had seen in Boston. I felt a familiar sense of helplessness, and surrounded by collapsed people, I felt myself mentally collapse as well. Then one of the women started to hum while gently swaying back and forth. Slowly, a rhythm emerged. Bit by bit, other women joined in. Soon, the whole group was singing, moving, and getting up to dance. It was an astounding transformation. People coming back to life, faces becoming attuned, vitality returning to bodies. I made a vow to apply what I was seeing there and to study how rhythm, chanting, and movement can help to heal trauma. We will see more of this in chapter 20 on theater, where I show how a group of young people, among them juvenile offenders and at risk foster kids, gradually learn to work together and to depend on one another, whether as partners in Shakespearean swords play or as the writers and performers of full length musicals. Different patients have told me how much choral singing, aikido, tango dancing, and kickboxing have helped them, and I am delighted to pass their recommendations on to other people I treat. I learned another powerful lesson about rhythm and healing when clinicians at the trauma center were asked to treat a 5-year-old mute girl, Ying Mi, who had been adopted from an orphanage in China. After months of failed attempts to make contact with her, my colleague Deborah Roselle and Liz Warner realized that her rhythmical engagement system didn't work. She could not resonate with the voices and the faces of the people around her. That led them to sensory motor therapy. The Sensory Integration Clinic in Watertown, Massachusetts, is a wondrous indoor playground filled with swings, tubs full of multicolored rubber balls so deep that you can make yourself disappear, balance beams, crawl spaces fashioned from plastic tubing, and ladders that lead to platform from which you can dive onto foam-filled mats. The staff bathed Yin Mi in the tub with plastic balls that helped her feel sensations on her skin. They helped her sway on swings and crawl under weighted blankets. After 6 weeks, something shifted and she started to talk. Ying Mi's dramatic improvement inspired us to start a sensory integration clinic at the trauma center, which we now also use in our residential treatment programs. We have not yet explored how well sensory integration works for traumatized adults, but I regularly incorporate sensory integration experiences and dance in my seminars. Learning to become attuned provides parents and their kids with the visceral experience of reciprocity. Parent child interaction therapy, PCIT, is an interactive therapy that fosters this, as is SMART, that is sensory motor arousal regulation treatment, developed by my colleagues at the Trauma Center. When we play together, we feel physically attuned and experience a sense of connection and joy. Improvisation exercises such as those found at this website http://learnimprov.com also are a marvelous way to help people connect in joy and exploration. The moment you see a group of grim-faced people break out in a giggle, you know that the spell of misery has broken. Fifth, getting in touch. Mainstream trauma treatment has paid scant attention to helping terrified people to safely experience their sensations and emotions. Medications such as serotonin reuptake blockers, Respiridol, and Seroquel increasingly have taken the place of helping people to deal with their sensory world. However, the most natural way that we humans calm down our distress is by being touched, hugged, and rocked. This help this helps with excessive arousal and makes us feel intact, safe, protected, and in charge. Touch, the most elementary tool that we have to calm down, is prescribed from most therapeutic practices. Yet you can't fully recover if you don't feel safe in your skin. Therefore, I encourage all my patients to engage in some sort of body work, be it therapeutic massage, Feldenkrais, or craniosacral therapy. I asked my favorite bodywork practitioner, Licia Sky, about her practice with traumatized individuals. Here is some of what she told me. I never began a bodywork session without establishing a personal connection. I am not taking a history, I'm not finding out how traumatized a person is or what happened to them. I check in where they are in their body right now. I ask them if there is anything they want me to pay attention to. All the while, I'm assessing their posture, whether they look me in the eye, how tense or relaxed they seem, are they connecting with me or not. The first decision I make is if they will feel safer face up or face down. If I don't know them, I usually start face up. I'm very careful about draping, very careful to let them feel safe with whatever clothing they want to leave on. These are important boundaries to set up right at the beginning. Then, with my first touch, I make firm, safe contact. Nothing forced or sharp, nothing too fast. The touch is slow, easy for the client to follow, gently rhythmic. It can be as strong as a handshake. The first place I might touch is their hand and forearm because that's the safest place to touch anybody, the place where they can touch you back. You have to meet their points of resistance, the place that has the most tension, and meet it with an equal amount of energy. That releases the frozen tension. You can't hesitate. Hesitation communicates a lack of trust in yourself. Slow movements, careful attuning to the client is different from hesitation. You have to meet them with tremendous confidence and empathy. Let the pressure of your touch meet the tension they are holding in their bodies. What does body work do for people? Licia's reply: just like you can thirst for water, you can thirst for touch. It is a comfort to be met confidently, deeply, firmly, gently, responsively. Mindful touch and movement grounds people and allows them to discover tensions that they may have held for so long that they are no longer even aware of them. When you are touched, you wake up to the part of your body that is being touched. The body is physically restricted when emotions are bound up inside. People's shoulders tighten, their facial muscles tense. They spend enormous energy on holding back their tears. or any sound or movement that might betray their inner state. When the physical tension is released, the feelings can be released. Movement helps breathing to become deeper, and as the tensions are released, expressive sounds can be discharged. The body becomes freer, breathing freer, being in flow. Touch makes it possible to live in a body that can move in response to being moved. People who are terrified need to get a sense of where their bodies are in space and their boundaries. Firm and reassuring touch lets them know where those boundaries are, what's outside them, where their bodies end. They discover that they don't constantly have to wonder who and where they are. They discover that their body is solid and that they don't have to be constantly on guard. Touch lets them know that they are safe. Sixth, taking action. The body responds to extreme experiences by secreting stress hormone. These are often blamed for subsequent illness and diseases. However, stress hormones are meant to give us the strength and endurance to respond to extraordinary conditions. People who actively do something to deal with a disaster, to rescuing loved ones or strangers, transporting people to a hospital, being part of a medical team, pitching tents, or cooking meals, utilize their stress hormones for their proper purpose and therefore are at much lower risk of becoming traumatized. Nonetheless, everyone has his or her breaking point, and even the best prepared person may become overwhelmed by the magnitude of the challenge. Helplessness and immobilization keep people from utilizing their stress hormone to defend themselves. When that happens, their hormones still are being pumped out, but the actions they are supposed to fuel are thwarted. Eventually, the activation patterns that were meant to promote coping are turned back against the organism and now keeps fueling inappropriate fight or flight and freeze responses. In order to return to proper functioning, this persistent emergency response must come to an end. The body needs to be restored to a baseline state of safety and relaxation from which it can mobilize to take action in response to real danger. My friend and teachers, Pat Ogden and Peter Levine, have each developed powerful body based therapies, sensory motor psychotherapy, and somatic experiencing to deal